Alrighty. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillahi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Welcome back, welcome home, everybody. We're going to continue, inshallah, our study of Imam al Nawawi's collection of 40 hadith. Tonight with hadith number 8. Hopefully, I think we'll be able to get through the whole thing, inshallah, in one session. There is a little bit of context to this hadith, so I want everyone to, as you're hearing the hadith as I read it and translate it, I want just everyone to kind of put a pin in it, because there's a context that needs to be explored in order for us to, inshallah, appreciate it. So this hadith is found in both Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. It's an Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال أمرت أن أقاتل الناس حتى يشهدوا أن لا إله إلا الله وأن محمدا رسول الله ويقيموا الصلاة ويؤتوا الزكاة فإذا فعلوا ذلك عصموا مني دماءهم وأموالهم إلا بحق الإسلام وحسابهم على الله تعالى رواه البخاري ومسلم. So this hadith is a proclamation of the Prophet ﷺ and an explanation of something. But again, as we find out time and time again with the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that there's just so many layers to it, layers of eloquence and beauty. So what does the hadith say? The hadith starts by the Prophet ﷺ saying that I have been commanded to, and the verb is uqatila, which comes from qatala. So literally it means to kill or to fight. But in this verbal form, it can mean to engage in conflict, armed conflict, or it can mean to oppose. So if like I fought against this bill or this law, like that's obviously figurative language. It doesn't mean that I literally fought it. So it can mean to kill, it can mean to oppose. But again, we're not like, what's the word? This is not apologetics, all right? This is what he said, but I'll explain again the context. An-nasa, which typically means people, like all people. So if you translate just that first part, I was commanded to kill all people. All right, now everyone's like, wow. But this is a good lesson also on the importance of understanding the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, because everything he says comes from a reality. And everything the Prophet ﷺ teaches and says has to be understood within the context of course, the Quran and also his life, right? Because his life is the greatest explanation of his statements, okay? And so he says, I was ordered to fight the people hatta yashhadu an la ilaha illallah, until they bear witness that there's nothing worthy of worship except for Allah and that Muhammad ﷺ is his messenger, and they establish prayer and they give zakat. Once they do that, فَإِذَا فَعَلُوا ذَلِكَ عَصَمُوا مِنِّي, if they do so, then they will have gained clemency or protection from me, dima'uhum, in terms of their lives, their blood, wa amwaluhum, and their wealth, illa bihaq al-Islam, except for what is due in accordance with Islam, wa hisabuhum ala Allah ta'ala, and their ultimate reckoning, their ultimate judgment will be with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so all of us can appreciate that this hadith being translated and posted would be something problematic if a person did not understand the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So there's a couple things here, and it turns from it being like, oh man, this is making me nervous, to, oh man, this is actually quite beautiful. The first thing to understand the context of this is that unanimously, all scholars of hadith, when you're doing the breakdown of the hadith, they explain that this hadith is referring specifically to the people who were the enemy combatants of Islam in Mecca. So those individuals during the conquest of Mecca, that basically during the entire messengership of the Prophet ﷺ, quite literally his entire messengership, made his life difficult at every opportunity that they could while he was there, and also after he made hijrah to Medina, that it was something that was just constantly there. And so the Muslims, for the beginning portion of it, did not engage in aggressive armed conflict. They just responded by defending Medina until the point where, when they came to open the city of Mecca, to conquer the city of Mecca, there was no blood that was spilled, right? And so understanding that this armed conflict or engagement that is found in Islam is one where ultimately the best case scenario is not to kill somebody or defeat them. The goal of fighting is actually not to fight. Is to remove the need to fight. It's to remove the need of engaging in combat. And you actually have the Prophet ﷺ saying in another narration, al-harbu khuda, that war is deception. And again, this hadith, if it was posted on Fox News, it's like, here we go again. But the lesson behind the hadith about war being deception is that the Prophet ﷺ is telling us that when push comes to shove, when all other ways of reconciling have broken down, and the only foreseeable reconciliation is going to be, or the only foreseeable, not reconciliation, but resolution to this conflict is going to be armed, the Prophet ﷺ says, you are allowed to then engage in some level of deception in order to resolve, because ultimately human life is more valuable at that point than unrefined and pure honesty. So what does that mean? What's an example of this? The Prophet ﷺ, when he was going to Mecca during this conquest, inevitably, these people that had been fighting him up until this point now for almost 2 decades, their ego, their pride, it was greater than their threat of arms. Like, their ego and pride was huge. And part of it was that we're not going to go down without a fight. Now that's inevitably going to lead to a lot of death and a lot of bloodshed and a lot of whatever that comes with that. So what does the Prophet ﷺ do? He commands his companions to, the night before, when they're right outside the city of Mecca and it's completely pitch black, he commands his companions to go and start their campfires, to go and start these campfires. And normally there's a lot of people per campfire, traditionally, right? Let's say there's 10 people, but the Prophet ﷺ told them, only one of you go per campfire. Now, what does that do? It gives the impression to the Quraysh, to the Meccans, that there's a lot of people. And what that does is it scares the daylights out of them. And so what they do is they actually concede defeat before any fighting occurs. Now, was this like the most honest and unrefined truth that the Prophet? No, this was obviously a war strategy, but it was done in order to preserve life, not in order to take life. You also have other examples of the Prophet ﷺ in Medina with people that he was authoritative over, did not take life, when actually he even had the right to. So you have the tribes of Banu Qurayda, Banu Qaynuqa. You had these tribes that literally tried to assassinate him numerous times. He would go meet with their leaders and they would plan to drop a boulder on his head or these things, and he would find out and he would get up and leave. And at that point, he has every right to take retaliation upon them. But what he did was he gave them the opportunity to leave, to expel them. You can't live in this city anymore. If we don't feel safe around you, you can't live here. You also had hypocrites like Abdullah bin Ubay, who at every moment that was critical, the Battle of Uhud, trying to withdraw people that were under his influence, made life very difficult, even to the point where it got personal. He made up and perpetuated the rumor about Aisha radiallahu anha not being faithful. So, which of course was a horrible moment, hadith of ifk. So you have all these examples where the Prophet ﷺ would have been justified in engaging in some sort of what's the term that they use? I forget how they translate, but engaging in some sort of recourse, physically, even execution style, with a person who committed treason against the community, for example. Like Abdullah bin Ubay during the Battle of the Trench, what did he do? There was only one possible way that the Quraysh can get in, and Abdullah bin Ubay and some other hypocrites, they basically tried their best and eventually gave the Quraysh a way in from that one path that could have led to a lot of bloodshed had the Muslims not stopped it in time. I mean, that's, even in modern nation states, that would be a crime that would be punishable by execution, right? If you give an enemy that's trying to come in and harm you this. So we have no problem with that. But the Prophet ﷺ did not actually enforce that punishment. What is all this to say? It's to show that this is clearly an exceptional statement. This is not the standard, and this is not the culture of the Prophet ﷺ. He's saying that with these people, we have exhausted all options of coexistence. We have tried our best to share the Arabian Peninsula. And every year, there's some sort of conflict, some sort of armed engagement that they come, they try to show up, they will attack our caravans, they'll do this. And so he says that I have now been commanded by Allah that the only way to exist with these people is to engage with them in armed conflict until they accept what we're saying. Okay? Now, amongst these people were who? You had those at this time, you had individuals like Amr ibn al-As, you had Ikramah ibn Abi Jahl, you had Abu Sufyan, you had these people who literally were the thorns in the side of the Prophet ﷺ for so long. And they caused so much pain, or they were the children, like Abu Jahl's son, Ikramah. Abu Jahl was quite frankly, if we don't want to talk about trauma, he was probably the most traumatic individual that existed in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab, those two. And you have now his son, Ikramah. So what does the Prophet ﷺ do? And this hadith, like this story, is actually a perfect explanation of this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ says, I was commanded to fight them up until they accept that Allah is the only thing worthy of worship, Muhammad is his messenger, they pray and they pay zakat. At that point, then they're all good with me. So now Ikramah, when the Prophet ﷺ arrives at the conquest of Mecca, and they start rolling in, there's no bloodshed. The Prophet ﷺ is actually coming in with his head lowered from humility and gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he has told Abu Sufyan and some others who have come out and taken shahada before that if you tell everyone just to stay in their homes, they'll be fine. Like, we're not blood hungry people. If we come into Mecca, we just want to come and tawaf, and we just want to come and visit the Kaaba that we've been banned from visiting, even though everyone else in Arabia can come see it, but you've banned the Muslims. We just want to come, make tawaf, visit the Kaaba, etc., perform our umrah. That's it, right? We just want to do that. Ikramah, who knows his father is Abu Jahl, I mean, what would you do? He did what we would probably do, which is he ran. Because he's thinking, I'm done. Like, there's no way. So he dips and he runs and he escapes all the way, some narrations say, all the way to the coast of the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula. He's trying to hop on a boat and just go as far as he can, because in his mind, the battle's over, the Muslims have won, and the top, what happens after any war, you take the top leaders of the losing side and you make examples out of them. And he's like, I don't want to be made an example out of, so he dips. When the Prophet ﷺ hears that he left, he actually sends some people and says, go and get him. Go and call him back and tell him that he has my promise of safety. Not gonna execute him, not gonna take his life. As long as we can coexist, he'll be fine. Ikramah, this is such a shock that when his wife and the other messengers come to him and tell him this, he doesn't believe it. He's like, y'all pull my leg. There's no way that he said this. He goes, no, he said this. So he comes back and Ikramah actually ends up accepting Islam. What does the Prophet ﷺ do? The Prophet ﷺ is sitting there with his companions and he says to them, as Ikramah is approaching from a distance, he says, if I hear one of you say anything about his father, you're in big trouble. I don't want a single person here to say anything disparaging about his father. His father was who again? Abu Jahl. And the Prophet ﷺ understands that even though Abu Jahl is Abu Jahl, and even though Ikramah is his son, and even though he did what he did, and maybe part of the nature of life is that when you oppose something for so long and you end up having to concede, maybe you do have to get your nose rubbed in it a little bit. You know what I mean? If you talk trash and you end up losing, maybe part of the reality is that you do kind of have to deal with the consequence of the harassment a little bit. The Prophet ﷺ says not here. Why? Because he has now joined our community. He's Muslim. And once you enter into Islam, your dignity, your life, your wealth is sacred. And we're not going to let even a single word take away from that. So he tells the companions, when you mention him, when you talk to him, don't speak even with a negative tone about his father, the one who went to war against us, the one who killed many of our family members, the one who, don't even say it. Just call him Ikramah. Don't even say Abu Jahl, because we don't want him to remember any negativity from that. Okay? So this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ is saying, it goes from being a hadith that is somewhat strict and very firm and very rigid to what is the Prophet ﷺ teaching us? What he's saying is, once a person accepts the same message and the same belief that you have, they're off limits. It doesn't matter if that person, if you disagree with them on very fundamental things, if you disagree with them, like think about all the things you disagree with people with. What is a common disagreement for people to have with each other? Get uncomfortable. Think of all the uncomfortable family dinners. Huh? Where to put things? Okay, that's pretty docile. I was expecting, okay, yeah, a little vaccination indication. Okay, that's obviously hot right now. Okay, what else? Politics. So they say, what do they? Don't talk about religion or politics at dinner. Those are the common secular philosophy, right? Don't talk about religion or politics. Because why? Because those are two things that people hold very near and dear, what they believe and what they believe. That's pretty much what religion and politics are. Are they even separable at this point? What they believe in terms of divinity and what they believe in terms of political philosophy, very near and dear. If you mention anything, then it's as if you just shamed someone's parents. It's as if you just, you know what I mean? And this stuff is so, Allah programmed us to be so emotional about this, that what does he say in the Quran? He says, do not curse those who worship other than Allah, because they will in turn do what? They will curse God. They will actually, if you curse someone else's God, and it's not a real God, it's like, you know, an idol that they worship, and you think you're being particularly religious in that, right? Like someone says they believe in something, you're like, that's dumb. What are they going to say? Your religion's dumb. Islam is dumb. Allah is that. And so Allah instructs us in the Quran, don't do it. Don't do it, because you don't know what reciprocal like provocation you're engaging in. If you see someone that believes in something that you don't agree with, the best policy in 99.9% of times is silence. There's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, don't ever be a man or a woman who curses their parents. The companions were shocked. They said, Ya Rasulullah, a person will curse their own parents? He says, yeah. They said, how? He said, by cursing someone else's parents. Because when you curse someone else's parents, naturally, what is that person going to come back with? I mean, we grew up with this. Your mama, right? Like, that was what we grew up with. So the Prophet, 1,400 years ago, taught us about the poison of your mama jokes. Like, he taught us that, which is, if you say something about someone else's parents, you are then inviting the vitriol and the venom to come back at your parents. So don't curse your parents by cursing someone else's parents. So there are certain topics that we admit as human beings, and there's no way around it, that we just feel very strongly about those things. And it's not bad. It is what it is. But no matter how much we disagree with somebody on something, as painful as it is, if they believe what we believe in terms of faith, they are our brother and our sister, and they have dignity and honor that is irrevocable. It cannot be taken away from them. The only time someone's belief or the honor that belief gives somebody is taken away, as Imam al Nawawi says in his book on Aqidah, when they revoke it themselves. Meaning what? I'm no longer Muslim. If they say that statement, right? Then in theory, yes, they don't have that sanctity anymore. How important and valuable is this sanctity that every Muslim has in the eyes and hearts of another person? The Prophet ﷺ stood in his final khutbah. What would you say if you knew that this was going to be your final opportunity? Not final khutbah ever, but the farewell khutbah, right? What would you say if you knew that this was your last chance to talk to the entire ummah? Like, what advice would you give? You know, imagine people think about, subhanAllah, this is actually a really interesting, kind of sobering, but very realistic activity. Think about what advice you would give if you were lying on your deathbed. What would you tell your family, your friends? What would you say? Right? There's so many things you could talk about. So the Prophet ﷺ, he is, aware that this is going to be the last time that he will make the pilgrimage. And he's standing there on the Mount of Arafah, and he's giving the khutbah, and he says, Inna dima'ukum, okay, wa amwalukum, wa a'radakum, alaykum haram. He says, all of you collectively here, your lives, meaning like your life, like you can't kill somebody, okay, and your property and he's speaking here individually, all of you, collectively but individually, your lives, your property. And he says, وَأَعْرَادُكُمْ, and your reputation. That's very interesting. Because the first two is like, yeah, we get that, inalienable, right? Someone's life and their wealth, their property. You can't mess with that. But then he says, your reputation are haram. Haram casually means forbidden, but linguistically means sacred, sanctified. It's forbidden because you can't trespass. Haram means no trespassing. Okay? That's why we call the sacred mosques the Haramain. They are places where you can't do certain things, right? Because those areas are so sacred, it is haram to engage in certain actions in those pieces of land, in those areas. So he said, your lives, we agree with that. You can't take someone's life, of course. We agree that stealing is problematic, but what about the reputation? Right? That's the one that's so powerful here. And then he says, just to emphasize how serious this is, he says, كَحُرْمَةِ يَوْمِكُمْ هَذَا, just like the sanctity and the respect all of you have for this day. What day was it? It was Arafah on Hajj. So all of us who have been for Hajj before, you know Arafah is like the day. So much so that if you miss it, your Hajj is not valid. There are other things that if you miss or if you're deficient, you can make it up through some sort of expiation or something, right? If you mess up something or if you forget, there's always sort of a way. Arafah is one of those things that no, you can't. Like it is, come back next year. That's how sacred that day is. And obviously we know the blessings and forgiveness. There are more people that their lives and their souls are saved from the hellfire on that day than any other day in the year. It's a very sacred day. He says, كَحُرْمَةِ يَوْمِكُمْ هَذَا فِي شَهْرِكُمْ هَذَا in Dhul Hijjah, which we know is the most blessed 10 days of the year, right? Not 10 nights, 10 days, okay? And he says, in another narration, he says, فِي بَلَدِكُمْ هَذَا, in this land, Mecca. The Prophet ﷺ is, and in another narration, in order to set this up, he says, do you guys think that this land is special? And they all said, yes. He said, do you think that this day is special? They all said, yeah, of course. He said, do you think that this moment and this month is special? They all said, yes. And then he said, just like you think all of this is sacred, guess what? Your brothers and sisters' lives and property and their reputations are also sacred. So this idea that as soon as a person accepts the same creed that you accept, that you believe, that this person is off limits, is something that Allah and His Messenger have made very clear. So what does this mean in practice? You tell me. Today is like a particularly uncomfortable hadith, because I think there's a lot of us that can be honest and admit that there's been many violations, right? So what is the Prophet ﷺ saying here, and how can we practically apply this hadith?
Not even like considering somebody of the religion, but it could be if you're trying to with the same way or because the way they were talking with it is what all of those things fall under.
Very good. That there's an element of just, at the end of the day, this is where that massive ethical principle of benefit of the doubt, of making excuses for people, this is where it comes from. It's not just like a character thing. It's actually a theological underpinning. Because why? If we remove giving people the benefit of the doubt, then the community falls apart. And what happens if the community falls apart? You can no longer say, Ihdina siratal mustaqim. You can no longer say, Alladhina amanu. All these plurals that we find in the Quran, there's a reason why the plural was used. Because this thing can't be done individually. It can't be. I mean, proof of that, just think to 2020. Like, what was the spiritual state of Ramadan 2020 versus 2021 generally? There are some, right, mostly imams who were like best Ramadan ever, because imams were like, very happy to have a little bit of time where they could reflect instead of constantly worrying about, but generally speaking, the ability to pray next to each other, the ability to have iftar together, break fast, right? The ability to have suhoor together, to spend late nights after praying, socializing with friends, however people may have applied that, but nevertheless, that ability is something that Islam has built into it, which is what? Community. And the quickest way to disrupt community is to break apart the trust and the benefit of the doubt that we give one another. Think of your own relationships and friendships. What's the quickest way that they've disintegrated is when people start to what? Resent one another because of certain things that they've assumed. And how quickly a person is corrected and embarrassed when they've assumed incorrectly. So that's very good. What else? How do we apply this hadith? The end of it's very important too. And I want to go back to the end of it just to kind of clarify. And he says that once a person has established prayer and given their zakat, he says, asamu minni, that they have, like, in terms of our community, like, that's it. And then he says, فَحِسَابُهُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ ta'ala. Their ultimate reckoning is with Allah. It's a very important principle to have in your mind and heart at all times, which is what? I can disagree with somebody, and I can even disagree with them religiously, but I am not allowed, it's actually in fiqh, by the way, in Islamic law, unless something, the Prophet ﷺ, the only thing that he gave as like a litmus test to ensure that somebody was in fact a believer are things that there's no disagreeing about them. Like, can anyone say that prayer is not a thing in Islam? It's one thing to not pray, but can anyone say, no, prayer is not a thing? No, it's not, right? And actually, the differentiator between a person who, according to the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, the person who is Muslim and who is not Muslim is the one who abandons the concept of prayer, not practicing it, right? If somebody struggles to pray due to weakness, that's one thing. Of course, that should be worked on. But when a person then has the audacity to say, no, prayer is not a thing, right? I can believe and I can practice how I want, but the salah, the 5 daily prayers, not a thing. That's one of the litmus tests, unfortunately, of a person sort of exposing that faith is not accurate. The other thing is zakat, which we talked about last night during heart work. Why is zakat so important? Because if a person tries to remove the institution of zakat, they're not only harming themselves, they're harming those recipients. That's why Abu Bakr and others, they went to war over this stuff, because they're like, we're not going to let you take away money from people who need it, right? How dare you think that you can do that? So the Prophet ﷺ says, as long as a person believes in those two things, there's no purity test here. There's no, okay, show me. How much Quran do you read? How do you wear your clothes? How do you wear this? How do you dress like that? What sheikh do you listen to? Like, all of these questions. Think about it, man, subhanAllah. And shaitan's greatest goal is to drive people apart from each other. Because the sheep is easiest when it's alone, when it's away from the flock. And human beings, subhanAllah, one thing that we do that we have to work on is not fall into the trap of finding divisions amongst ourselves. Focus on the common, not the differences. I'll never, when you travel overseas to a place where you don't feel, where you can't speak the language, you don't know much about the culture. When you even hear someone that speaks your language, like if you hear an English word, you're like, right? You look like, who said that? Because for 6 days I've only been hearing this language, and like, what? Somebody just said, like, sandwich? You just look and you're like, who? And then you meet them, and it's as if you're in-laws. You're like, oh my God, come, sit here. You don't know anything about them, right? And you're just like, come. And you talk. And this actually happened to me. I met someone at an airport when I was traveling back from a country, and they spoke English, I spoke English, and we became best friends. And then when we got on the plane back to America, we were flying back to Chicago, and he told me that he was from Wisconsin. Yes, and instantly, jokingly, but kind of real, I was like, oh, Packers fan. And he's like, yeah, you Bears fan? I was like, yeah. And that brotherhood that we marinated in for like 3 hours waiting at our terminal started to fracture. No, and seriously, and it actually started to fracture. It happens. And then we started talking about college football, and it was like Tennessee, Oh, I'm a Georgia fan. Oh God, right? And then it's like, and then like no longer do I want to sit next to you. No longer, because again, why? We find differences amongst each other, right? Instead of focusing on the things that we do that are more common. And this happens in the ugliest of ways. Race is the most obvious. Gender, socioeconomic status, outwardly identifiable devotion practices. Like these are all ways in which Shaitan loves to see people tear that fabric apart from each other. But here you have the Prophet ﷺ saying, as long as this person believes that Allah is one and His Messenger Muhammad, and as long as she believes that prayer is a thing and zakat is a thing, and they try their best, then this person is due your respect, your reverence, and whatever their end is, فَحِسَابُهُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. You leave that up to Allah. And one of the scholars, Ibn Hajar, when he was commenting on, I forget which hadith it was particularly, but he was commenting on a hadith that dealt with the same topic. How do we deal with somebody who, they say they're Muslim, right? That whole culture, subhanAllah. They say they're Muslim, but they do this or do that, or don't do this or don't do that. And he said, the answer he gave in summary was, it's safer to assume that this person is closer to Allah than you are than it is to assume the opposite. Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, very powerfully said, I would rather accidentally include 1,000 people who were not Muslim into Islam than accidentally remove somebody from Islam who actually was a Muslim. Like I'd rather just incorrectly assume everyone here, like I'm shopping and it's incorrectly assume that they were Muslim, right? Rather than one person who I see in my heart, I'm like, are they truly? He's like, I'd rather do that. I'd rather err on the side of caution, because the gravity of removing somebody from the community is really serious. And some people, may Allah protect us, we've already removed people here. The way we think about them, they've been removed. Some people, we have the courage, may Allah protect us, to even say it, right? Like to our friends, and some people even further than that. And what a horrific moment it's going to be on the Day of Judgment when we have to come to meet with these people in front of Allah and explain to Allah why we felt so comfortable playing the judge of someone's faith when the Prophet ﷺ clearly said, you're not in charge of that. So this hadith went from being one that was a little bit like, wow, that's kind of firm, to being, man, this is the most inclusive and this is the most like welcoming. And even in the commentary, subhanAllah, they talked about like all these different points that the scholars mentioned of this hadith is the hadith of community building. That you look around and you see that what pulls us together is way stronger than anything that could drive us apart. So it has to do with all those things. And then of course, the last thing that they mention is, reconciling any illness that people have between each other. So the Prophet ﷺ demonstrated this perfectly and beautifully. But at the same time, we do have stories in the seerah where people did get into conflict with one another. It did exist, And Shaykh Abdul Nasser beautifully, when we went over those narrations and talked about it, very famously, there's one with I forget, man. It's either Abu Dhar or Abu Darda. I forget exactly. It was Abu Dhar. Abu Dhar, yeah. إِنَّكَ رَجُلٌ فِيكَ جَاهِلِيَّ Abu Dhar. Yeah, so he said that. So Abu Dhar referred to Bilal as Ya ibn Sawda, oh, you son of a black woman, when they got into a disagreement. So Abu Dhar referred to him by his race. And this was something, of course, rightfully so, it really bothered Bilal. So Bilal, he goes back to the Prophet ﷺ and he complains to him that Abu Dhar said this. Now, why did he complain to him? He complained to him because he's like, I thought we were brothers. Like, why would a person feel that they can refer to me with this kind of like disparaging? He wasn't being factual. He's not a genealogist, like biologist trying to like state facts that you are a son of a woman who was black. No, he was obviously using it in a connotation and a tone that was meant to be hurtful. So Bilal was very hurt by that. He goes to the Prophet and says, Ya Rasulullah, why would he say that? So the Prophet ﷺ, man, stop me if you've heard this one before, but man, subhanAllah, he looks at Abu Dhar, and this was the messenger of God. He let people pee in his masjid. He let people grab him by the collar. He let people cheat him in business. He let people make up things about his wife that weren't true and did not kill that person. When Umar said, Ya Rasulullah, why don't you just kill him? Like he's causing so much issue, so many problems. The Prophet ﷺ said, I don't want them to say about me later that Muhammad killed his companions. Because people don't know what's in that guy's heart. I do. Because he's exposed himself so many times. And Allah has even made it clear to him that this person is from the hypocrites. But if I kill him, the history books are going to say Muhammad killed his companions. In fact, Abdullah bin Ubay, the one who pulled all the group away from Uhud, the one who pulled all of them away from Tabuk, the one who made up the rumor about the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, he was buried in the shawl of the Prophet ﷺ, right? And this again was done to give solace to some of his family members. Anyways, the Prophet ﷺ, when Abu Dharr came to him and Bilal complained to him, he pointed at Abu Dharr and he said, "Innaka rajulun fika jahiliya," that you are a man that still exists within you. There is some ignorance. And the narration says that his finger was pointed at him and that his face became red and that the vein in his side of his head began to appear. I mean, if you're talking about on the scale of things that would make someone angry, you have an insult here and you have everything else that we just talked about. And none of these things evoke the same response as this. Then what does that mean? It means that the honor of Bilal, it was more painful for the Prophet ﷺ to see a brother or a sister disparage one another than all of these other things combined. And he looks at him and says that. Now, what does Abu Dharr do? Abu Dharr, they walk away. Obviously, the record has been set straight. He's corrected. He was embarrassed. He was humbled. He walks away and he goes to Bilal and he says, I want you to insult me like I insulted you. I want you to give me, basically, you owe, like I owe you one. Like you have a right. I hit you, you hit me back. And Bilal's like, no, dude, I don't want to do that. Like we already settled it. It's fine. And Abu Dharr, because again, he's Arab. Arabs are over the top a little bit. So if you're Arab here, I'm sorry. No Arabs here? No, okay. A little bit over the top. If you ever talk to me, a little bit dramatic. So he goes, no. And he goes, I humiliated you, and I'm not going to let you go until you humiliate me. Like, we need to settle the score. Bilal's like, relax. It's fine. Like, you settled it, right? Abu Dharr gets on the floor and takes Bilal's foot and puts it on his face, which is like a big no-no, especially in Arab culture. I imagine in every culture, but especially in Arab culture. Puts his foot on his face and said, I embarrassed you, now you embarrass me, right? Because he was the spirit of brotherly love and sisterly love and community was so missing, and the Prophet ﷺ, with that one sentence, told him that this is from Jahiliyyah. This that you just displayed is from what you were before. You brought it into to who you are now, not allowed, right? And so he was so moved by that he said, I want to make things right. I want to change, the way that was. So this Hadith, Imam al Nawawi includes it in order to instill in us the importance of remembering and honoring one another. And this obviously trickles down to backbiting and all those other things. We're not going to go into that, but just know that this is the overarching umbrella. If somebody is Muslim, you're not doing them a favor by respecting them, right? It is due from you to respect and love your fellow brother, Muslim sister, or brother. Is something that we have to do, and we will be able to see the Medinan community when we do that. We ask Allah Ta'ala to make us amongst those who respect one another and love each other. We ask Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala to make us amongst those people who take care of the honor of our brother and sister, especially when they're not around, and that we ask Allah to remove from our hearts any ill thoughts about people or individuals when we see or hear anything, and that we're able to give them the benefit of the doubt at all times, and that we never ever trample upon the sanctity that Allah Ta'ala gave them. As he said in the Quran, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, that Allah Ta'ala knows who the most honorable are by their taqwa, so treat everybody as if they're honorable. Ameen, ameen, ya Rab. Any questions regarding this hadith at all? Anything? There's one obvious question, but I'm waiting for someone to ask it before I ask it. Anybody? What's the obvious question? Usually it's like, well, if I'm getting married to somebody and I want to make sure that like they're a good person, but like I can't like assume anything about them because of what they look like or what they do, then like how do I, you know what I mean?
Seems like a special circumstance.
So it's a good question. So the scholars actually, what they say is that, نحكم على الظواهر, like basically we operate functionally by what is outwardly apparent. The Prophet ﷺ, when he says فَحِسَابُهُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ, he's talking about the afterlife. So we don't make assumptions about how a person's status is with God, but we can act according to what we verifiably, and again, there's a whole ethical category to this, verifiably know about somebody. For example, the Prophet ﷺ told somebody not to get married to somebody because they had anger issues. So he said that. Now, is the Prophet ﷺ saying, and he's going to hell? No. He said, no, marriage is not a good situation for this particular person because they have issues with their character. Now, he didn't make a statement about their faith. He just said this is what their character's like. So what does that mean? It is a fine line, but we can use our best judgment to try to ensure that we, number one, we operate within the best of faith that we can. And number two, that when something as specific or important as like marriage, going to business with somebody, like anything that's super critical that has long-lasting implications, that there is a certain standard of due diligence that a person can do. Now, does that mean I need to see your receipts from the last, your bank statements for the last 20 years? No. But what it means is we use the process of community reference. We use the process of our own getting knowledge of the person. And also we use, of course, our intuition. Allah Ta'ala gave our hearts the ability to sort of weigh things out. How do you feel? Do you feel comfortable or not comfortable going into business with this person, getting married with this person? And it's interesting, subhanAllah, because, as Shaykh Abdul Nasser always taught us and that we've always learned in our own experiences, like faith is not what makes people compatible necessarily. So in anything, in business or in marriage or anything. So faith alone is not it. So there's a lot to be talked about there. But nevertheless, this is the most foundational, and it's talking about their afterlife, their status with God. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Any advice you have? I mean, I think all of us at some point end up sometimes in a social context, maybe work or like a masjid or otherwise, where we might have concerns about a particular person, their ability to perform a certain task, or lead a certain group or something like that. How to go about having what might be an important discussion without unnecessarily harming someone's reputation?
Yeah, so it's tough. I mean, there's an entire, I would say, there's an entire discussion about the ethics of being able to criticize, because we just covered ad-din al-nasiha, right? So we just covered the hadith that talked about feedback.
I thought I was out loud.
Oh yeah, so meaning that wasn't me trying to take a shot. It was me saying like it's interesting how Imam al Nawawi tied those, like he's placing this compilation and he put this one after this one. So what I would say, Allah knows best, is that like there's always a right way and a wrong way to do something. There's necessary actions in life, and there's right ways and wrong ways to do them. Generally, from my mistakes that I've made now in my life, I've found that the wrong way are usually the quick ones, and the right way are usually the ones that require more patience and creativity. So for example, like if you have to give, I could use the example we were just talking about. So if somebody comes to me and says, what do you think about this person for marriage? I could creatively, in a way that still preserves their dignity, politely recommend that person maybe not be considered. Or I could just be quick about it and be like, no, they're this. You know what I mean? One of them will save me time, but one of them will save that person's honor. And subhanAllah, once you say something about somebody, you can't fix that. It's very difficult. Even if you go back on it, it's still going to exist in the consciousness of the person that heard it. That's one of the things about backbiting, is like, why is this such a big sin? It's because you basically put something out into the universe that you can't fully ever take back. It is what it is, And so my advice, based on the research that I've done on like how to give nasiha, would be basically do all of your due diligence about that reality. Is the person a certain way because of something? Is there a circumstance that needs to be considered? Give them the benefit of the doubt, talk to them, hear their side, all this kind of stuff. Then when you have to move forward with a decision, whether it's hiring or firing or marrying or not marrying or any of that, the critical decisions, do so in a way that basically is almost like a panel of praise about everything else besides the one thing. So somebody's like, hey, do you think that this person is qualified to be in this position? You say, you know what? I know that they're like a really amazing husband, or they're an incredible wife. I know that they're, I trust them with this, that, X, Y, Z. I do know that this position requires a person to be very organized. And amongst all the great things that, Ali has, or Abdurrahman has, or I don't know if that's their strongest suit, right? Again, you're basically saying no. Like, I don't recommend this individual for that. But you're doing it in a way that's like so complimentary that it doesn't even, it's almost like the person doesn't know whether to say thank you or like, you know what I mean? So, and I've witnessed my teachers do this. And it took me a long time before I realized that I was like, I thought we just talked about, so private conversation, we talked about how this person is like not at all somebody that we would consider for this. And then when it came time to have the large group conversation, it almost seemed as though my teachers were praising them. And I had trouble like squaring the two. I was like, we just privately talked about how this person is not at all qualified, but you're basically making it seem like they just barely missed it, And I realized later, years later, that this was just good adab. And I was horrible. And so this is something that I'm still working on, but I think that there is space for being honest and feedback, but creatively doing it in a way that does not, damage, of course, the dignity and honor of a person. And again, I don't think the damaging is done by being honest. I think it's more so in the way that it's done. So Allah knows best. Allah. Any other questions? No? Is that just a fly? He really. Okay. All right. Barakallahu feekum, everybody. Jazakumullah khairan. Inshallah, we'll see you guys next week, bi'idhnillah, for our 9th hadith, inshallah. Okay? I think we have samosas. Will the timing change at some point? The good stuff. Based on Maghrib?
I'm just wondering if
in general, I think we're going to be okay with it for now. Inshallah, we should be moving into the new building like in the next few weeks, 2 to 5, roughly.
So this class will be in Carrollton?
Yes. Wow. Inshallah, we'll see. I'll update everybody. But if that's the case, the timing might change slightly. Yeah. From here, it's from the VRC, it's about I think 16 minutes or 17 minutes, not too far. From here is a little bit further. So, ask Allah to accept, inshallah. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.